It's science that has really put the case together for the shroud's authenticity. But for whatever reason, it seems like forever we're waiting for science to give us the final answer.
Hey, I'm Guy Powell, and welcome to the next episode of the backstory on the Shroud of Turin. And of course, if you haven't already done so, please visit guypowell.com and sign up for more of these episodes. As you know, I am the author of the book "The Only Witness," which is a Christian historical fiction tracing a possible history of the Shroud over the last two millennia. And today we're speaking again with David Belz. We spoke with him about a month ago. And he is definitely one of the known well-known Shroud researchers and speakers on the Shroud. And we're going to get some interesting perspectives on how he views the authenticity of the Shroud. So with that, let me just jump right in with the first question. Judge Belts, so what is your professional background and how has that influenced your interest in the Shroud of Turin?
2,000 years ago, something happened that changed the world. A burial cloth witnessed the most significant moment in human history: the resurrection of Jesus Christ. It survived fires, wars, plagues, and floods, traveling across empires and centuries to become either the most sacred relic ever known or history's greatest fake. What do you believe? The Only Witness. A compelling history of the Shroud of Turin by Guy R. Powell. The Only Witness is available now on Amazon. Get your copy today.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me back because that's a compliment in itself. I guess I did mess up the first time, but um, yeah, my background I think is relevant to the discussion today because I was a trial lawyer for 32 years in Orange County. I did quite a bit of trial work, criminal work, including murder cases. And I was a personal injury attorney for 27 years. I've tried many, many, many different types of cases. So my background as a trial lawyer was, to me, one of the reasons why I got interested in the Shroud. And then I was appointed to be a Superior Court judge in Orange County in 2009, and I quickly went into assignments that were bench trial related. In other words, they weren't jury trials. And so I did family law for 5 years, where I was the judicial officer, and then I went into probate, and they asked me to do the law and cause probate trials or trust trials. And those are bench trials that are 4 days or more. So my background is trial, 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 evidence, evidence, rules, etc. So it seems to me that for somebody who has that kind of a background, I know for me, I was curious, and I've used that word more than once. Why wouldn't you want to get curious about this thing? Because if we can put a case on that it actually is the burial cloth of Jesus Christ that proves and confirms that he actually did rise from the dead, I mean, from a pragmatic, legal, secular standpoint, that's quite remarkable. And so my background, I think, lends itself very well to wanting to know more and getting more curious about the shroud.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, it's definitely interesting and an interesting direction to look at as we're investigating the shroud. I mean, a lot of people would say, well, we only have evidence since 1353, 54 or so, and Lee Ray, which I think is true. We only have, clear provenance that it was there in Lee Ray, and then it goes and migrates further, eventually through Chambéry, France, and then to Turin. But before that, there's no direct evidence to say that, hey, it was owned by this person or that person or whatever, going all the way back then to the time of Christ. So looking at it as a legal, with a legal perspective is kind of interesting. So last time we spoke about those legal standards and what you would use in courts and juries and judges to prove a fact. And so, why do we need proof when our faith does not require proof as it relates to the shroud?
Well, we don't need proof to have faith. I mean, that's clear. I mean, I have many very strong Christians that are either interested in the shroud or not interested in the shroud. It doesn't impact their faith directly per se. But there's an old saying that I think is kind of relevant, and that is, for those who believe there is no need for an explanation, and for those that do not believe there's no possible explanation. So we get into this realm of the spiritual and proof of spiritual, and that kind of gets in the way of science, because science is kind of limited. It has limited itself to natural phenomenon, studying only natural phenomenon. Well, when you get into something like the shroud, you're talking about something that goes beyond natural. And I mean, quite frankly, the shroud is a scientific mystery. I mean, it's been studied for 48 years. The STURP study was in 1978. They've been studying it. There are so many papers and studies and researches, and I mean, study by science. And they don't have an explanation for how that image came to be on that piece of linen cloth. And so 48 years, and they haven't been able to solve it. So I don't think it's a scientific mystery. And the other thing that I think is important, sometimes I'll hear people say, well, we don't really need to have proof. You don't, okay? But guess what? Jesus appeared to his disciples for 40 days after the resurrection. He gave them proof. They had proof. They all got proof. They saw him physically, okay? That's a pretty strong sign, to see him physically, where you could put your hand into his side, as Thomas did, and see that he's actually there, which, also lends itself to confirmation of the church's teaching that Jesus was fully human and fully God. He had a human side, a body side, and he had a spirit side. He could walk on water. He could walk through walls. He could heal people with a remarkable supernatural power, right? So anyway, I think it's not necessary for faith, but at the same time, why should we shy away from it? Because it is what it is, and it's the most remarkable thing ever.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And one of the challenges too for science is that it's very hard for science to uh, develop, I guess, algorithms and hypotheses and theorems for a singular event. As far as we know, this is the only event that has ever happened, at least here on Earth, where this creature, this man, and both the man and divine was resurrected and came back. He came back to us so that Thomas
Right.
could put his, as you said, Thomas could put his fingers in the wounds, and he was bodily there as well as spiritually there. So what an awesome thing, and that is kind of the evidence that's provided in the Bible to support all our faiths.
Yeah. And obviously, people can read scripture and believe scripture and develop a very deep, profound relationship with Jesus. There's no doubt about it. You don't need the shroud to have faith, right? As we said before.
Yeah.
Nonetheless, it's here. And it is pretty remarkable. I think my background. I'm on the board for the Shroud Center of Southern California, that was founded by Dr. Augustus Seta in 1995. And we have these images on full Kodak film, backlit, right? It's almost as good as going to Turin. You can see everything you want to see about both the horizontal, what we call the negative image, I guess, or the positive. That's always a debate. Is it a negative or a positive? But that faint image, and then that other image that was on the other side that we didn't even know existed until the modern era, when we could take a photograph of it.
Mm.
So, and you said something earlier, thing I think is really important from my perspective. Having been a trial lawyer and a trial judge, under both the federal rules of evidence and as I practice under the California Evidence Code, it's very clear under the legal reasoning and rationale of the law. When we're talking about proving a fact, we have two ways of proving it: direct evidence and indirect evidence, or circumstantial evidence. And under the code, the evidence code, both federal and state, circumstantial evidence is to be equally weighted by a jury as direct evidence. Okay. And I can tell you right now, in a trial, when you have physical evidence of something, as opposed to somebody saying something that's part of the story of trying to prove a fact, when you have physical evidence of something, it changes the dynamic of proof, because that physical evidence has obviously the ability to carry more weight. We call it weight. And so, federal jury instruction 1.3, it is your duty to find facts from all of the evidence. And this is one of my beefs about science is we'll see these papers where somebody will zero in on one little thing, one little inconsistency or one little scientific fact, and they say, well, obviously, well, this suggests that the shroud isn't real. It doesn't work like that. You have to look at all of the evidence, and we're going to talk about all of the evidence today and go through those points, and they start to add up. And trust me, as a judge, when I'm sitting on the bench listening to both sides of the case, I learned early on when I got appointed, because early on for about 6 months I did jury trials and criminal jury trials until they sent me over to family law. And I had to teach myself, I have to wait until both sides put their case on. Prosecution DA gets to put his case on, hold it. You can't decide until the other side gets to put their case on. And how many times did I realize that after the second case was put on, oh, there are some pretty good questions here as to what the truth is, right? So you have to look at all of the evidence, both direct and circumstantial. And then another important evidentiary part of the law is corroborating evidence. Corroborating evidence is really significant because Casey 107, that's California jury instruction, civil jury instruction, Casey 107. Corroborating evidence is independent evidence that supports other evidence by showing it is more likely to be true than not true. So really important that we have. And now what do we have with the shroud? Corroborating. It just is overwhelming, the amount of evidence that points to its authenticity. And by the way, this is something that I read in a book by a very well-known, he's passed on now, Tom Anderson, very, very well-known plaintiff, personal injury attorney. And when I was on the board of directors for the California Consumer Attorneys as well as the Orange County trial lawyers. And so I knew a lot of lawyers, trial lawyers. And Tom wrote a book called Verdict, where he looks at Old Testament passages and did more or less a brief on them. And after analyzing those Old Testament passages and looking at Scripture, he said, "This is clearly it was predicted exactly what Scripture said happened to Jesus, and it was his way of saying, I've got to believe in this." Right? That's a perfect example, okay, of corroboration of something old. But he wrote in this book something I wasn't aware of. California Evidence Code 643 and 1331 and Federal Rules of Evidence 901 and 803. They both talk about ancient documents and that ancient documents can be accepted as authentic simply because they're ancient and they have a long-term history of having been accepted, okay? So that would apply in this case to the scriptural references of the shroud. In other words, do we know that there was a shroud? Well, we do, because we have John 20:3-8, where it says, Peter and John went into the tomb, saw the burial cloths, and believed. What caused them to believe? They saw something, right? And you could say, well, maybe they saw this or maybe they saw that. But guess what? Maybe they saw exactly what we're seeing on the shroud. And they were wise enough, smart enough to go, what? He's gone. The body's gone. And this is what we have left. I mean, you have to put yourself in that place and use common sense and ask yourself, what was going on at that moment? And then in Matthew 27:59, they wrapped the body in clean linen cloth. There you go. Linen cloth. The shroud is linen cloth. By the way, it's herringbone, right? And at the shroud presentations at Shroud Center, Southern California, Lee Sweeney has been the docent there for 25 years. Lee will go to the kids. We do a lot of kids who go, guess what? You know what herringbone weave is? It's a 3-in-1 weave. Son of a gun. We have a 3-in-1 weave on the linen cloth that appears to be the burial cloth that they wrapped Jesus' body in. 3-in-1 relates to what? The Trinity. So all of these little things, you start kind of adding them up. And by the way, here's a couple passages for Bible scholars. Okay, Galatians 3:1.
Let me interrupt you there. One other thing on the herringbone. Why is it called herringbone? What is a herring?
It's a fish.
It's a fish. And is the
and
fish
what was
a
the symbol that they used, right? By the way,
Exactly.
that's a really good point that you could use in a trial, right? Herring is a fish, and they had to speak in secret. They called it the discipline
Of the secret.
of the secret, where they had to be really careful what they said. They couldn't just put in scripture or write something, say, "Hey, we got the burial clause. Come and see it." It that would not have worked. Somebody would have grabbed it, right, and taken it
Yep.
probably. And but here's a couple good passages, and you can. Yeah, did Paul know about the shroud? Do we have firsthand evidence? No, but can you believe that he didn't? I can't. I mean, it's physical evidence of the resurrection, right? So here he writes in Galatians 3:1, "O stupid Galatians, who has bewitched you, before whose eyes Jesus Christ was publicly portrayed as crucified?"
Yeah.
Okay, what's he saying? He's kind of using cagey words, but you certainly could relate that to the shroud. And here's another one that I've had discussions with a number of priests and go, "Oh, I don't think so." Well, guess what? I do think so. Okay. Again, I think Paul knew about the shroud. Here's 2 Corinthians 4:5-7. And this is just a part of it. So you'd have to read the whole section 5-7. This is just 7. But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all surpassing power is from God and not from us. 2 Corinthians 4:5-7. Treasure is an object.
Yeah.
It is an object, like an artifact, like a shroud. Okay. So could Paul be kind of alluding to the shroud in a discipline of the secret way, not really saying what he's talking about, but telling us we got this thing? I think maybe. You could certainly make the argument. And if somebody wants to make the other argument, have at it. But I can make that argument, I think.
Well, and one other thing that might be interesting, and as you were saying it, I wrote it down here, is so Pam Moon, I don't know if you know her, but I'm sure you know of her. She's been trying to explain some of the stains that you find on the shroud, and it's obvious that it was folded up, and it looks like it may have been put into a clay jar. And those stains, then, depending upon the folds,
Good point.
then kind
Good
of
point.
are corroborating evidence, or this is corroborating evidence of that we have put treasure in jars of clay to show that this is the all-surpassing power of God and not from us. And so, it could be. I mean,
Yeah, you can make the
but it's,
case
yeah,
for
you could
sure.
make the case. Absolutely.
Yeah, and you're right. Those water stains are saying that maybe it was folded and it sat in water, and that's where the water stains came from. And that, by the way, that's more actually forensically plausible than water from a fire. Okay, because these stains are symmetrical and they look like
Hmm.
they were formed over time. Again, forensics in trials, my criminal trials, my civil trials, we would put on experts, forensic experts, to provide expert opinion testimony. By the way, in a court of law, science is part of the evidence that we receive in and consider. It's not the only. Science is not the only. And science doesn't necessarily carry the day. You want to know why? Because I can be sitting in a trial or putting on a trial, and I have my expert and they have their expert, and they're both scientists and they're both qualified and they both testify to their opinions. And guess what? They're different. Different
Yep.
opinions, right? So we have to understand. I mean, it's science that has really put the case together for the shroud's authenticity. But for whatever reason, it seems like forever we're waiting for science to give us the final answer. We don't need to wait anymore, in my opinion. Okay.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. I do want to, if you don't mind, I do want to go back to one thing you said is where a lot of people take one piece of evidence and then say, well, that's it. That's it. I don't have to even think about anything else. And the medievalists, as they're called, those that believe that sometime in the medieval time period that the shroud magically appeared as a fraud or something like that, number one, and then it was that was corroborated, I guess, by the radiocarbon dating. And they ignore all of the other evidence, all of the other mentions, all of the biblical mentions, just like you have
right.
here.
Right.
And so instead of taking the weight of all of the evidence, they take one thing. You look at, just like you were saying, well, I'm only going to look at and listen to the prosecution side. I'm not going to look at the defense side. And it's kind of like, well, they shut their mind off to the rest of the evidence.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
in a trial, obviously you can't do that.
Yeah, and I think we talked about this the last time we were together about implicit bias, and it's something that we, as judges, we are trained on it all the time. We have to check our biases, right? When we get into trial, my bias, my opinion is over here somewhere. Now I'm doing this, right? And it was one of the best things about being a judge was to be able to put aside my biases and just decide the case on the facts and the evidence before me. And by the way, there are cases where the evidence came out this way, but there may have been some truth to the other side, but they didn't do a very good job of putting their case together. So they don't win if they don't put their case together in a way that is persuasive and you can make a finding based on it, right? So and that's what happens a lot, especially with science. I mean, I think we talked about this. This is something that I was curious about, and I did a little research. William Whewell, ever heard of him? William
No.
Whewell. He was a he was in London in the 1830s. Whewell, William Whewell. And Whewell and a group of his buddies decided from here on out, we will be known as scientists. And a scientist is someone who studies the natural order of things, that by which we can touch and feel and see with our senses. So they kind of cut out the supernatural side of reality, okay? Because you can't, supernatural is real, okay? But they kind of have, they put a box where science, and it kind of makes sense. It's hard for science to do scientific testing on supernatural, right? They can do testing on natural, but it's also, I think, created in some corners of science a little bit of a bias, And we got to be careful that we're not being biased. We got to be careful that we're judging the evidence based on the evidence. Now, I'm here and I'm telling you right now, I'm putting the case on for the Shroud, okay? Because that's kind of where I'm at. Is I wanted to know what the evidence was. What's the story here? And it's pretty powerful. And I think we talked about this before. In the law we talk about burdens of proof. And in a civil case, you have these various burdens of proof. You have preponderance of the evidence, which is defined in the jury instructions as more likely than not. In my trust cases and in other cases where there is based on what happened in that case, there's a presumption that something's true. When there's a presumption that something's true, there's a higher burden that you have to meet if you're the proponent, and that's clear and convincing evidence. And the difference between preponderance of the evidence, which is more likely than not, and clear and convincing standard of proof is it's probably more likely than not. And because there's so much corroboration and evidence that points to the Shroud's authenticity, I think you can clearly make the case that it's clear and convincing. And people will throw in beyond a reasonable doubt, which is the standard that we use in criminal cases, which is fine. But I mean, the point is the evidence is really, really strong. And a couple things I want to point out quickly before I kind of get into
Yeah.
the science part. And that is you've done a lot of work on history. And I think you're planning on doing another work on history. And this is the history of the Shroud is where we can appreciate the equal weight that direct and indirect evidence is given. Okay. And going back through some of the significant historical references to the Shroud. And I think I mentioned this last time. I mean, one day I was in Mass and I was listening to the Nicene Creed, and there it was, light from light, right in there, light
Yeah.
from light, God from God, light from light. Like, what are they referring to? And some people, well, they were referring to the Arian heresy. Well, guess what? Maybe, for sure, but maybe more, right? Because the reference to Jesus and light is quite significant in the New Testament, right?
Yeah.
Light
Yeah.
from light. Interesting reference in the Nicene Creed, which is 325. And then we can look at the Christ Pantocrator, that image. And people can look this up on the internet. Christ Pantocrator. It's an icon. he found in the Sinai originated back to 600 AD. 150 points of congruence with the shroud, with the face on the image of the shroud. Justinian coins they found going back to 695, 132 points of congruence to the image of the face on the shroud, right? There's a connection there. I put that case on all day long.
Yeah.
Sudarium of Oviedo, the facial cloth, we believe, okay, that goes back to the 7th century with 120 points of congruence. By the way, I probably should make myself clear. And I've used facial recognition experts in trial, in my trial days when I was a trial lawyer. A facial recognition expert will look for points of consistency to match to images or face. In this case, we're talking about faces, right? And 70 is typically considered to be, I think it's 70, if that's right, the lowest level. You got to have at least 70 points where you can say these two images match, right?
Mm. Well,
Well,
and you have to similarly, just to interject, you've got your fingerprint. And I don't know how many it is, but I think it's like 10 or 12 points. That's all you need on your fingerprint. And
yeah,
here you've got over 100.
exactly, exactly. So those are circumstantial references to the shroud. And using direct, when Peter went in, he saw something. That's direct evidence of that there was something on that caused him to believe, right? Well, these are references to something that the only logical way that somebody could have painted that Christ Pantocrator image is if they had seen the facial image on the shroud. So the shroud had to have been something that he was aware of, that painter was aware of, in order to create that. The Justinian coins, the same question. Pope Stephen III, this is one we use at the Shroud Center, excuse me. This is in 795. Pope Stephen III, a cloth on which the glorious image of our Lord's face and the length of his body was so divinely transformed that it was sufficient for those who could not see the Lord's body in the flesh can see the transfiguration made on the cloth. Those are pretty descriptive words.
Right.
He's
Right.
seeing that image on that cloth. Remember, we did at that point, we didn't know we had this three-dimensional original image, the dark image that we talk so much about. All he saw was that faint image on the piece of cloth, and there he is. He's describing it exactly, right? He had to have seen it. Okay, so it existed. Circumstantially, say, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4 examples. Pre-Codex, that's another good one. That's an icon that they found in 1192, and it shows the same pose as on the shroud. The arms crossed the same way. It had a herringbone weave on this icon. There were poker holes from as you know, there's poker holes from a fire where there were some little holes that were burned into the shroud, into linen, and then the 4 fingers. And we'll talk about the science of the 4 fingers too, because this is when it really gets fun for the lawyer, for Dave the lawyer. Okay, not Dave the judge. Well, Dave the judge too, but Dave the lawyer. And then I wanted to mention a good article for those who are interested, academia.edu, tons of articles in there, academia.edu. And one of them I could refer you to, The Chain of Custody, The Shroud of Turin and Its Early History by Daniel Clausen, Clausen. Okay, so having said that, I want to now touch a little bit on the carbon dating. Again, because I'm
Yeah.
kind of putting on the evidence, okay? And so in a case like this, remember, the plaintiff goes first. If you're the proponent for something, you go first. So I'm the plaintiff in this case, I'm going first. I'm putting the evidence on, okay? I know that the defense is going to be offering their own version of what they think the truth is, okay? And as you know, I'm off the bench. I do mediation work now. And what that's trained me to do is obviously hear and consider both sides in a case. And so I know that the defense is going to argue carbon dating, right? So I got to put that case on first while I'm putting my evidence on as the plaintiff or the moving party, okay? So we have the radiocarbon dating. And so, and that seems to be fooled a lot of people. Not some, not Sue Benford and Joe Marino, didn't fool them because they're the ones that put that paper together and went to Italy when Barry was there. As you probably know that story, Barry Schwartz was there. And they
Yeah.
presented this proposition that no. That carbon dating can't be right. There's too much other evidence, right? Other evidence that points to authenticity. And they challenged it. And ultimately turned out that they had probably a correct reason to challenge it. And so, and I don't know all the story to this, and maybe you do, but I do know that there were some scientists in Italy that wanted to get the data from the three carbon dating centers. They couldn't get it by asking for it, right? In other words, there wasn't easy full disclosure. By the way, I'm a big full disclosure judge.
Right.
Disclose.
Yeah. What do you have
If you
to
don't
lose?
disclose, what do you have to hide, right?
Yeah.
Disclose, right? They wouldn't do it voluntarily, so they had to file a lawsuit under the Freedom of Information Act to get the data. And then they got the data and they analyzed the data and they found that the data was not consistent between the findings of those three data centers. So my argument would be, and by the way, as you probably know, Oxford University has acknowledged, I guess the quote that they made on this when they were challenged and said, wait a second, you guys said it was accurate, and now this data is showing that it's maybe not accurate. And they even acknowledge it by saying the data has been seriously questioned and there are statistical incongruities. So there's a problem with
Right.
their scientific method, and one of the first things I remember learning about in Chemistry 101 in high school was before you do a scientific test on anything, you better make sure you know that the thing that you're testing is what you think it is. Number one, right? Otherwise, you're testing something that may not be what you think it is, and your results are going to be not accurate, right? So there's huge questions that were brought out in that conference in 2015 in Catania, where a bunch of scientists came together and said, this data is not consistent. It doesn't we can't rely on it. Okay, so we still hear a lot about carbon dating, but they pretty much made that carbon dating not reliable just by the fact that its science doesn't appear to be reliable, okay? Without getting into the details of that. And then, as you know, we have the vanillin loss test that I think Giulio was involved in that in Padua in Italy, Giulio Fonti. The flax, they tested the lignin. Lignin is a plant polymer in flax, and they tested that to see what kind of degradation had occurred in it, and it clearly was way earlier than the Middle Ages. And then recently, the wide-angle X-ray scattering that was done that also measured the structural degradation of the flax fibers, wide-angle X-ray scattering. So the carbon dating controversy seems to kind of be behind us, okay? Because certainly the carbon dating results are, by anybody who's got any scientific integrity, is going to say we can't really trust it, okay? But that was an example of there were people that put their bet on that result, but then there were people like Sue Benford and Joe Marino who said no, that can't be right because there's too many other points that support that this is the actual burial cloth, right? And that's and Ken Stevenson is.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Okay, what a great man he is, right?
Yeah.
He's still living, and he was on the STURP team in 1978. He was kind of a spokesperson. I didn't know this. Did you know this?
Yeah. Yeah. That he was the PR person. And I don't know if he actually went on site to Turin. He may have, but he was the person handling the PR for the STURP
I
team.
didn't. Ken told me something I wasn't aware of, and it's actually in his book, Verdict on the Shroud, which I've told him recently, please get it republished. It's such a good book, written really
Mm.
well, easy to read, right? Very comprehensive. I didn't know this. The STURP team, after they released their findings, they were basically told, you have to be very, very careful what you say about this. They were kind of told, don't get out there and start promoting this. That is the shroud. Okay.
Mm.
Which I can understand why they would do that because they don't want people to start taking advantage of the information that they had, and benefit from it. At the same time, it kind of really allowed for naysayers to carry the day for decades, right? And, again, here's my lawyer, Judge, and I read the STURP study. Let's go through this really quick, okay? Because the STURP, and if anybody hasn't read this STURP summary, the 1981 summary from the conclusions from the 1978 STURP team, let's go through this. This is lawyer Judge now, okay? We conclude, now some of this I'm quoting, we conclude for now that the shroud image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. Bingo. All right, now that's got to get your interest, okay? Was Jesus scourged, and crucified? Yes. It was a human body under that shroud. That's really important, especially when we get into some of the evidence questions, right? And it's in a state of rigor mortis, which that lasts between 36 and 48 hours, right?
Right.
Jesus was going to rise how many days?
Yeah, on the third day.
Third day. Hey, what do you know? That body's still in rigor mortis. It's right in that third 3 days, right? So
Yep.
there's another good piece of evidence. The first line of the STURP summary has always caught my attention. And how does it read? It says, no pigments, paints, dyes, or stains have been found on the fibrils. Now, when we had, by the way, we had moved the Shroud Center that Dr. Aceta put together. It was in an office building with his brother in Fountain Valley here in Orange County. We moved it out to Santiago Retreat Center where we had a larger place to display it. And we could really take advantage of bringing crowds of people in, right? And I remember, and by the way, one of the boxes that we have the two images on Kodak film, but Gus from Barry Schwartz also has full-size vertical, the mass paralysis spectroscopy study. Okay. Now, what is that? Well, and this is the story that I kind of got. But it's a fun way to share it, and how much detail there is, I don't know. But I understand that in talking to Barry Schwartz, who unfortunately is passed, what a loss that was. But in talking to Barry, when they asked him to go to Turin to be one of the photographers, the official photographer for that STURP study, his question was it Don Lynn that asked him from Jet Propulsion in Pasadena? But he said, "Why would you want me to go? I'm Jewish."
Yeah, Dan Devine.
And yeah, and the response was, "Well, so am I. What matters? What does that matter?" But I remember,
Well,
Barry,
so is Jesus. So
exactly. And so I remember Barry telling me, I kind of thought this was going to be cool. That it was all paid vacation to Italy. They're going to fly me over there. They're going to put me up. I'm going to be in Italy. I can have a vacation. We're going to be done with this thing in a day or two. Because he was clearly a skeptic. He thought it was a forgery.
Yep.
Okay. Right? And only Barry can only tell that story.
Yeah, it's funny too when he tells it.
And it's so funny when he tells it. And so, he thought, well, let's do a paralysis mass spectroscopy. We'll figure out what that artist used. So they stretched it out and they ran light through it to see if the light would pick up the matter that would be involved in either the paints, the pigments, the dyes, or the stains that they assumed a human artist had used to put this thing together, to put this image on this piece of linen cloth, right? And guess what happened when they ran the light through the cloth? The image disappeared. And we have that at the Shroud Center. It's so cool. It's one of the best exhibits from from an Evans standpoint, because I'm going, the image disappeared, so it can't be an artist. There's no substance. You can see the blood, which blood has matter, right? It has atoms and neutrons, right? It's got matter to it. Well, this light was designed to identify anything that had material properties, right? Well, the image disappeared. So boom, right? I mean, that one caught me right away. The image is on the cloth. We talked about this, the 3-in-1 herringbone. And samples of that have been found at Masada in the Judean desert. There's photographic qualities. It's got a positive and a negative, two sides to it. The faint image and then that dramatic three-dimensional. It's three-dimensional, as we know, which means that when you take a picture of it and you get the, what do you call it? I call it the positive, I guess. The dark image is three-dimensional.
Yeah, it's just I use the black and white versus the
Thank you.
the
Thank you.
original. Yeah.
Because I'll ask Gus and he'll say one thing. I ask Barry and he kind of
Yeah,
explains
yeah.
one.
Well,
But we have
and
the
some people
faint
will say
image.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's not a
Yeah.
negative. It just has negative qualities, so it's the black and white.
It's dark with three-dimensional qualities. Okay. It's, by the way, again, it's three-dimensional on a non-photographic piece of linen cloth. It's not Kodak film, it's linen cloth. By the way, young kids, we go, do you guys know what Kodak film is? And they'll go, no, we don't.
Well, and I think that three dimensionality is such an important fact. I mean, two things. One is how could a forger in the 13th, 14th century have even known about painting in a three-dimensional way?
No.
Number one, and then number two, that it's just such a surprise that, when we're used to looking at a photo, you look at the photo and you see your kids and your mom and dad or whatever it is, and you don't think of it as necessarily being three-dimensional. And then all of a sudden, this thing has three-dimensional qualities. That is so important.
It's so amazing. And by the way, and this is the way I describe it, we got a photographic image on a piece of linen cloth that's three-dimensional on a piece of linen cloth at a depth of 0.2 microns. Now, I had to look that up because math was not my strong suit. Okay. My brother was the CPA, I was the lawyer. Okay. So I had to look up 0.2 microns. 0.2 microns is 350 times thinner than a sheet of copy paper. Let me say that again. It's at a depth of 0.2 microns, which is 350 times thinner than a sheet of paper. There are no known physical or chemical methods to account for it. And they said in the STURP summary, it is not the product of an artist. 5 days of scientists with 2 tons of equipment doing everything they could do under the circumstances to examine this thing scientifically. And at the end, the consensus was could not have been caused by an artist. Why are we spending 48 years talking about who the artist was that could have done this? It almost becomes, almost laughable at times, okay?
Yeah.
And then they said, the answer to the question of how the image was produced, which was one of the primary reasons they went to Turin. How was that image produced on that piece of cloth, right? They said, and what produced the image remains now, as it has in the past, a mystery. Bingo.
Yeah. Yeah. One thing I think that is just fascinating, about all of this is you mentioned Dan Clausen's name before, and he put out a paper which has to do with why would somebody make a fraudulent something of the shroud? Why would there be why would you make a fraud? Why would you forge an image of Jesus from the tomb? What is the monetary or other value that I would get? And first of all, just to answer that question, if I were going to make a forged copy or a forged product, um, I would say, well, I'd read the Bible. If somebody was paying me as the forger and somebody was paying me to write this and to paint this, then I'd say, well, it's got to have blood on it. It's got to have, an image on it, and it's got to have, the other signs of the resurrection or of the
And the
crucifixion.
and the passion,
Yeah.
what they did to him, the
Right. And
wounds.
so and so on the shroud, you have an image, a painted image, and you have blood on there, but it's an unpainted image, but on a forgery, it would be a painted image. And so then right there, all of this study here says, well, it just can't be a forgery. And for me, that's another, nail in the coffin here that it just can't be a forgery. Well, who was going to make money? Who was going to gain power? Who was going to get value of some kind by paying somebody or doing it themselves to come up with a forgery? And to think that, that was the argument. And why would they paint an image on the cloth? Why would there be an image on the cloth? if I truly followed the four gospels, there's no mention of an image on the cloth. So if I was going to make a forgery, I would never put an image on there because that would be made up. It wouldn't be true.
Right.
So there'd be no corroborating evidence to your point. And so it's just fascinating to to think about now what would somebody have done if they wanted to make a forgery? And so they would not have put an image on it. They would, that would not exist.
Yeah, and another point that I think is part of the legal analysis or the presentation, if you're the proponent, is look at it either was done by a human being or God. We have no rational explanation in our reality zone that we understand about the world and history and everything. It's either human or divine.
Yeah.
There's no other option. Okay. Well, there's a problem with the human. And by the way, this starts to get fun as a lawyer. I mean, one of the best things about being a trial lawyer, especially when I was doing criminal defense, which I did that for about 4.5 years, and I was with a really prominent young group of lawyers. I mean, we were getting every big case. It was a fun chapter, right? I was Angelo Bono's attorney for a while on the Hillside Strand. We were getting every big case. It was fun. And in criminal, you're constantly just trying to find a way or a weakness in the DA's case. And if you could find that weakness, you would hammer on that point to try to get the jury to believe that your case was accurate or not. More often than not, we lost. But we were pretty good at it, right? When I became a plaintiff civil attorney, now I have the burden of proof, right? And so what's fun about trial is when you're the proponent, or even when you're on the defense, you look for those little key, like, I gotcha points, okay? So if somebody's going to argue, this is a good one, and Dr. Aceta pointed this out. If somebody's going to argue that it was an artist, okay, your points are well taken, but there's more, okay? And I mentioned this before, 4 fingers, okay? We see 4 fingers where it's like this, okay? Where's the thumb? Right? Well, we know now that the nail didn't go through the palm. It went through Desto's space, which is between the hamate bone, the capitatum, and the lunatum bone. It's a little space in the wrist. And when a nail goes through there, it impinges or squeezes the median nerve. When the median nerve in the wrist gets squeezed or pinched, the thumb goes in like that. Okay? So we got a person that's showing just that with no thumb. There's no way an artist in the Middle Ages would have known to include that characteristic because he
Right.
had no idea
Right.
what the
Right.
median nerve was. Okay. So that's a fun one. Another really fun one that we use with the kids was to go, okay, so there's human blood there. We know that there's a human body. Okay. So is it consistent that there would be human blood? Yeah. So if you're going to say it's an artist and the artist painted the blood on or put the blood on, okay, that was a really clever artist because the blood contains bilirubin. And bilirubin is a hormone that the liver produces when the body's under extreme stress. Okay, so that was a really clever artist in the Middle Ages that knew enough to put bilirubin in that blood when he didn't even know what bilirubin was. Okay, you see what I'm saying? There are these moments in a trial where you can just kind of nail the other side with the facts that there. Another one, the image, if it's an artist, all artists, they have to draw. It's a drawing, okay? The edges are sharp in a picture. The edges are not sharp. They fade away in this, consistent with the cloth dropping down through the body. Dr. Aceta did that famous study at Hoag Hospital here in Orange County, where he put himself into a nuclear gamma radiation device with dye in his body to see if he could create an image similar to the shroud. He did that with John Jackson and Ken Lyons, who was head of radiology at Hoag. And lo and behold, it had many of the characteristics. That kind of was something that led to the Paulo di Lazzaro series of testing that went on in Italy. The image on the body, those little hair. Oh, by the way, remember I read the first sentence, no pigments, paints, dyes, or stains have been found on the fibrils. I mean, when I first read that, I go, what the heck is a fibril? Right? Well, A fiber is a fiber and a fibril is a fibril. What's the difference? The fibril is a little thing that comes up from the body of the fiber, right? So that's the other remarkable. Well, those fibrils, not the body of the fiber, the image didn't get into the body. It just kind of went on the surface. Remember 0.2 microns? And so it's just on that, but it's cylindrical. It's consistent. There's no bulk color like you would have with paints or stains or dyes that would run. There's no evidence at all that the image that the cloth was pulled away from the body because there's no smearing of the blood stains. There's no capillary action that you would have with a liquid, right? Again, more evidence. Recent DNA research. You've heard about the recent study that they did with the DNA, where they
Yeah.
found that there's evidence that it was in the Middle East. And by the way, India too. That was really interesting.
Yeah,
The
that
line
was although that study is there's quite a few things that are wrong in that study, but nevertheless,
in the
if
DNA
the
study.
if the DNA was done correctly, then there's actually some very and I was studying it actually this weekend, and there's some very interesting probable conclusions that you can come up with from that. And the one big one I thought was fascinating was they looked at the DNA. There's two studies. There's one from 2015, and then the one just recent, the 2026. And he looked at the DNA of the environmental DNA that was in the face area versus the hands versus the feet and versus the glutes. And what was interesting is that the DNA on the face was not different from anywhere else, if I'm interpreting it right. And what that means then is if the shroud were folded up as the Mandylion is believed to have been, with the face exposed, then you would probably get different DNA on the face than anywhere else, and that's not the case. And so it's a reasonable conclusion then to say that that either the shroud was not folded with the face open for a long period of time, as is hypothesized if it's the same as the Mandylion, or it was never in Odessa folded up. And so
So
it's kind of interesting,
that's
as
fun.
a
See, this is fun stuff, right?
yeah, yeah,
It's totally fun. Why people don't get into this, I don't know, because it's fascinating, it's fun, and also it's introducing us to a different, broader reality than maybe we've limited ourselves to. A couple of things, and I want to mention something really important. Again, trial limestone. They found limestone of the oregonite with strontium and iron on the feet. Okay, consistent with Israel or Jerusalem. Crown of thorns. Here's a good one. The forensics say it appears that he had a helmet of a crown of thorns. This person that's the scourged, crucified man under the cloth, right? What record do we have of anybody being crucified that was wearing a crown of thorns? Only
yeah,
one, right?
yeah.
There's another, boom, hang it, okay? So the bottom line is all of these scientific facts, if you put them on in a court of law, having an opportunity to put the full case on, ultimately, it's a scientific mystery, which means it moves over into the realm of the supernatural because we can't explain it naturally. Okay. And it is what it is, but it's probably more because this is the other part. Recently, I don't know if I mentioned this to you. Did I include this in my materials? God, an amazing science is starting to kind of really wake up, right? Let me read something. See, science. This is an article recently on whether the quantum theory of science can now explain omnipresence. Omnipresence, okay? Which is what the church teaches about the heavenly realm. It's omnipresent, right? It says, science does not erase the majesty of the divine. It illuminates it, which is exactly what we're talking about
Right,
here.
right, right.
It shows us that we live in a universe filled with unseen forces, deeply interconnected and governed by mysteries that should leave us filled with awe and wonder. Awe and wonder. Exactly. This isn't about religion. This is about awe and wonder. Okay. And then last thing I wanted to get into before we leave, and this is something that was brought out in some of our work at the Shroud Center. Somebody came in and said, wait a second, do you guys know what the devotion to the Holy Face is? Do you know what that is?
No.
This stuff just it starts to kind of get it's so fascinating to me anyway. So modernism was kind of part of the William Whewell thing where science started to take over and we moved into this era of modernism. Okay. And the Pope was concerned about the errors of modernism and how man started to think that he was self sufficient, that he didn't need anything other than himself. Okay. And so that resulted in there were visionaries that were part of this. But in 1885, Pope Leo the 13th, now we have Pope Leo the 14th. Maybe there's a sign there for Pope Leo the 14th. Maybe you should take this a little further, right? In 1885, Pope Leo the 13th um, uh, declared he approved the devotion and establishment as an arch confraternity of the devotion to the Holy Face. The devotion to the Holy Face. 14 years later, in 1898, we saw for the first time, after Secondo Pia took his photograph, really the Holy Face. Because
Yeah.
in the, right? Because
Right.
listen to this. Here's the shroud. This is another one of those that caught me in the STURP summary. The scientists noticed something. While this type of contact might explain some of the features of the torso, it is totally incapable of explaining the image of the face with high resolution that has been amply demonstrated by photography. The face on the image stands out. That's a significant characteristic, right?
Mm.
And in at the Shroud Center, Lee Sweeney will take the kids and he'll say, "Okay, you guys, think about your mom. What are you thinking about? Are you thinking about her ankles or her face? Right? Right? And
Right.
so, well, right, because we connect with face. That's how we connect with one another. It's a connector. So, what does that tell us? It certainly suggests that there's a reason why that face has a little bit more resolution and stands out because he wants us to connect with him. And this is the part of the shroud that I think is sometimes not appreciated is there's more to it. Obviously, we don't need the shroud to have faith, but this shroud can take us into a deeper and more intimate connection with the person that's in that shroud. By the way, that's a person.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's funny when you think about how you recognize somebody. Now, there's a couple of other things that are interesting, but when we as, and we learn it when right from we're a baby, we see our mom's face and her dad's face right there. But we recognize, just like you were saying, we recognize people by their faces. If cut off the head and tried to recognize somebody, you would not be certain. Or, we have been trained, our eyes and brains have been trained to recognize someone exactly by their faces. And so, this, to your point, this devotion of the Holy Face, and then, and then portraying it on the shroud in higher resolution is just it's beyond imagination
And
that's
can
the
I mention
face.
this? Pierre Barbet's book, A Doctor at Calvary. My wife has had it for 40 years. That's a great work, by the way. If some of you haven't read it, pick it up and read it. It's really remarkable. One of the best parts of that book is when he describes connecting with that face on the shroud, right? And all of a sudden he realized what he was looking at, and it just like turned something on inside of him. And he recognized the tranquility that's there. That's the other thing about that image. He's tranquil.
Mm,
He's at peace. And you look at the body and what they did to him. I mean, you can see all of the wounds. You can see everything that they did. Okay.
yeah.
And and then you've got this and he noted, he says, I couldn't get my eyes off of his face and how tranquil and peaceful it was. Because he
Yeah,
is the Prince of.
he is the Prince of Peace. Absolutely. Yeah, very good. um we're gonna have to break. We've gone a little bit over right now. Was there one last thing you wanted to cover, or?
Nope. Other
All
than
right.
turning everybody on to Magis AI, Father Spitzer's Magis AI, and our website, shroudcenter.com. But get out there and get into this thing because I think it'll take you into another reality, because it's a reality that you will appreciate.
Yeah, absolutely. And it certainly is. And there's so much to learn. And the more you learn, the more you want to learn and the
Yeah.
more you want to uncover. And what I've found is you can't learn it all. As much as I want to. I'm stuck right now on the history and really understanding in particular the history of the shroud, and then also whether the shroud and the Mandylion are one and the same. And I could spend another year or two on that and
Yep.
just trying to get all of the different pieces to it. And that, let alone doing the study on the blood or study on, anything else that's on the shroud. There's so many different things to explore and learn about, and it's just absolutely a fascinating topic. But definitely visit if you're on the West Coast, visit the shroudcenter.com online, and then the Shroud Center. And where is that located in
In
California?
Silverado Canyon in Orange County. We're in Orange County, Silverado Canyon, Santiago Retreat Center. Santiago Retreat Center.
Fantastic. Well, definitely do that. And Judge Belz, thank you so much for today. It's been fascinating. I've taken almost a whole page of notes on things that I wish I knew and need to dig in further, and really appreciate it. It's been wonderful having you.
Thank you for having me. It was my pleasure.
Thank you. And for the audience, definitely go to guypowell.com or YouTube, the backstory on the Shroud of Turin, and listen to many other videos in this series on the backstory of the Shroud of Turin. And definitely, if you want to hear the first half of the interview for Judge Belz, that's also available. It came out a couple of weeks ago. And again, thank you so much, David.
You're welcome. Have a good day. Have a
Thank you.
blessed day.
Yes, absolutely. Have a blessed day.